All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Jonathan Rockoff, and I'm going to be your host for supporting LGBTQIA plus youth and teens. I'm very excited about this session today. We have a colleague and a friend of mine. Joe said, wait a second. Okay, so we got some people coming in. Thank you, Joe, for letting us know. I'll wait a couple seconds and we'll go ahead and get started. Joe said the last session ran a little long. So there's a few people who are probably going to be trickling in. Thank you for letting us know that, Joe. And Crystal, I want to make sure you can see the chat over there on the screen too. And you look at Socio, just make sure you can see that.
I believe I can. I have some that, yes, they show up on the side and
Yep.
I can see them. So, yes, we're good to go.
All right. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started again. My name is Jonathan Rockoff, and I work at the UNC Chapel Hill School of Social Work. And I am joined today by a colleague and a friend, Miss Crystal Coble, who we're very excited to have here. This is an extremely important session for youth and foster care. I myself was a foster care social worker for several years, and I wish that I had a training like this and all my foster parents had training like this back then. So I think you're all in for a real treat. Yep, we can see your comments. I think you're all in for a real treat today. Crystal is very knowledgeable on the subject and is a wonderful facilitator. So I'm just going to be kind of helping her monitor the chat, making sure everything's working, but she is going to be your host today. So I'm going to kick it over to her and let her introduce herself, and I will be in the background helping out. So go ahead, take it away, Crystal.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you all for being here. And so I'll start with yes, I work at UNC Chapel Hill School of Social Work. But more importantly, why I'm doing this session is for a few reasons. One, I am a member of the LGBTQ plus community and a parent to a 15-year-old, and so this topic is very important to me. And I hope that I can share some helpful information and maybe even answer some questions that you all may have. I will say that as I present this information, it's constantly changing. And for those of you who have teens in your home who identify as part of this population, may hear different language than you heard when, when you were younger. And so that's part of what we're going to talk about is how this is constantly changing and the complexity of sexual orientation and gender identity. So I'm going to start with our agenda of just the basic topics we're going to cover. So I am going to cover a little bit about terminology. I always start with that because it's always changing. Being able to have just a little bit of foundational information so that as we continue, we're all on the same page. Also, I'm going to go into the use of pronouns. That's an area I get a lot of questions about. So we'll talk about the use of pronouns and why they matter, as well as some risk factors for LGBTQ plus youth, and specifically those in foster care, as well as what I hope is going to be the most helpful part of this is the strategies for knowing this information. What do I do? How do I support children and youth in my home that identify as part of this community? All right. So to start with, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Now, I want you to type your answer in the chat pod, really just to kind of get you thinking on the relevance of this topic. So, my first question: at what age do most children have a stable sense of their gender identity? If you would just type in the chat pod what your guess may be, and it's fine that it's a guess. All right, so we have some answers all the way from maybe 8 to 17, 18. So, what I want to point out is this question is specific to gender identity. Now, if I would have asked this question related to sexual orientation, the answer would be very different. Now, this is a stable sense of their gender identity. So, most children at age 4 have a stable sense of their gender identity. So, if a youth comes to you and is telling you, as a foster parent, their decision to share something around their how they identify as their gender, this is something that they likely have been thinking about for quite some time. Now, that may raise a lot of questions, and we're going to get further into this concept of gender identity. But I just kind of start there because even if you have younger children in your home, this is still important information. This is not just when they get to teenage when we start having attraction, sexual orientation comes into play. All right. So my next question: about what percentage of youth in foster care identify as LGBTQ plus? If you would just and type in the chat pod. All right. So far, I see kind of anywhere from 10 to up to 60, 80. So for this one, um, within the last few years, there have been at least three studies who um, have all estimated that about 30% nationally of youth in foster care identify as LGBTQ plus. So I also want to point out that because youth in care often have difficulty trusting adults, you may not know their gender identity or sexual orientation until they've spent some time in their home, in your home. For some children, you may know because they share earlier on. Um, so we do know that in foster care, LGBTQ plus youth are overrepresented, and about 30% of youth in foster care identify as LGBTQ plus. So with that being said, as we talk today about things you can do to provide a supporting and accepting and affirming environment, um, I want you to think about the fact that any steps that you take to make youth in your home, feel welcomed, they're going to benefit all youth in your home, not just those who identify as part of this population. And again, you may not know if they identify, um, especially initially. So, any steps that we talk about, they are true for any youth that may be in your home. All right. So that's just a gives us some relevance now as far as um, this topic. So we're going to jump in to the acronym. A lot of times questions I get early on are around, language and the use of the acronyms and terminology. Um, so I'll start with these these terms. There was a handout associated with this session that you don't necessarily have to have for the session, but I wanted you to have reference to it. It does include the first two pages are terms. The first page is around terms related to sexual orientation, and then the second page is around terms related to gender identity. And those are separate because they are two separate concepts, even though they both fall under um, this acronym of LGBTQ plus. So during the session, you will hear me say, I'll probably use LGBTQ plus, but I want to first break down the different uses of all of this acronym and what they mean. All right, so starting with LGBTQ, that one has been around a while. And when someone uses that, meaning lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, now the Q, there's some disagreement on what that does and should stand for. For a long time, it was questioning. Also, it can be the Q in the acronym can be for queer. So if you see two Qs, one may be questioning, one may be queer. So I want to spend just a moment talking about the use of the word queer. For many of us, that term derogatory connotation. Using the term queer was not a good thing. That has changed. There has been an effort by the community to take that term back, and it's more of an inclusive term. So if you hear a child or youth that either says they identify as or uses the word queer, it is most likely it is not used in a negative manner by the youth of today. It is not used the way that it was years ago. Um, so when you add the plus on there, so we have LGBTQ. When you add the plus on there, plus is really an effort to be inclusive of all identities that may fall under um, this umbrella. So that can incorporate, it doesn't necessarily stand for just one specific thing. It's connected to the idea that identities related to gender and sexual orientation are complex. And there's not necessarily going to be a letter or a name to describe all of them. So this is really an effort to be more inclusive. You also may see an I or an A on the acronym, and that is to be inclusive of intersex and or asexual. Or for some, you may see more than one A because they also include allies on there. So again, that's just the general acronym and terminology that goes with that. What I don't do in this is spend, like, time necessarily going through, like, what in depth, what all of the terms mean, but on that handout, and I do see that there was a question on where do we find the handout. I do know that it was, gonna be attached to this session, so we'll make sure that we have that information so that you can access it, um, because I don't necessarily know right now off the top of my head how they're gonna have you all access it, but we will make sure that you do have, that information, but it is not something that you'll need for our time together today. All right, so a little bit more about language. Um, Important to remember, language absolutely matters. By being in the know of terms that are being used, it helps show children in your home, helps show foster children that language that is important to them, terms and concepts that are important to them, are also important to you. Um, Also, it is constantly evolving. So, what I share today, when I do this presentation or something similar for a different population in a year from now, it, it will have changed. I will say when we used to talk about this, 5 years ago, queer was not something that was um, as embraced. So it is constantly changing. So it is a lot to keep up with, but it's also important. Um, so what we're gonna do to just kind of get a lay of the land of sexual orientation, gender identities. I'm going to start us off with a video. Now, the video is only 2.5 minutes, but I think it is a really good way to kind of get us all on the same page so then we can jump into, well, what do I do with this information? How can I be supportive of teens and youth in my home? So I'm going to go ahead and play the video. And again, it's only about 2.5 minutes. So if something goes, left field with the video playing, we'll be back in a few moments.
Crystal, it sounds like the audio isn't really working as well. Is there a way to share audio?
Jonathan, I am not sure because I don't know that I'm doing anything different than when we did a test run of this. So let me try one thing.
Okay.
I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. So I am going to try doing the exact same thing, but without my headset on, to see if that helps, because that is the one change that I did.
Let's unpack this whole gender conversation. You use a device or a character called the genderbread man.
Person.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. The genderbread person.
It's okay. I found it really helpful to think about gender in a few different distinct categories. Gender identity, how you define your gender and how you see yourself. Gender expression, the different ways that we present or perform gender through our actions, our dress, and our demeanor. And biological sex or anatomical sex, the physical characteristics that make up our body that in many people's minds equal gender.
So gender expression is the way you present yourself to the world. So you could be talking about the way you dress.
Yeah.
The way you comb your hair
Or don't.
Or use product.
Yeah.
So everything kind of as it relates to the outside world.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's a perfect way of thinking about it. So even just, okay, so this is funny. The way that I'm sitting right now is a very feminine expression of sitting because like how we sit is gendered, right?
Meanwhile, I'm kind of man-spreading.
Yeah, you're man-spreading. You're not even giving me enough room to properly man-spread over here. This is the man cross, the masculine way of crossing a leg. This is just uncomfortable for me. Feels like so much.
It feels good to me.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's like yoga. Okay, now let's do the girl.
Okay.
So gender is different than sexual orientation.
Yeah.
But a lot of people get them confused.
Yeah. Gender is who you go to bed as. Sexual orientation is who you go to bed with. So if you haven't heard that one's important.
So let's talk about penises and vaginas, shall we?
Yeah, we might as well.
Let's just go right there.
If you haven't already talked about penises and vaginas, we need to talk about penises and vaginas because that's what everybody always thinks. Like immediately, as soon as you say gender, anybody who's walking by right now who's hearing us say the word gender, the first thing that's popping into their mind is external genitalia. They're thinking about penises and vaginas.
So, for the purpose of our discussion, the bottom line is your external genitalia does not dictate your gender.
Yeah.
Wait a second. Can you rewind that? The bottom line is your external genitalia does not dictate your gender.
Yeah. I mean, that I couldn't have said it better.
All right, so I'm glad it worked the second time around with me unconnecting my headset. Now, the other side of that, so part of the reason I use a headset specifically when I'm presenting is because I'm just a wiggly, squirmy person. And so that prevents you from having to hear like all that goes on when you're a wiggly, squirmy person. So I'll try to be still, but I can't promise for how long that will that will last. All right, so that video, I like to show it because I feel like it does a good job with breaking down concepts related to gender and sexual orientation. So you will see the genderbread person is the character that is used. So if you look up information about the genderbread person, there are lots of resources out there, whether it be, like videos or just the use of that character to describe differences in these concepts. So with now that we have a little bit of a foundation on the differences between the two, gender identity and sexual orientation. I'm going to talk a little bit about pronouns, which pronouns are connected to the idea of gender. And I get a lot of questions about pronouns. So, gender pronouns are the set of pronouns that a person is going to use to reflect their gender identity. So, the pronouns that I use are she and her. Common ones that you hear are she, her, hers, he, his. Also, the use of they, them to refer to a singular person. They, them is not necessarily plural to, several people. They, them can be used as a pronoun that someone identifies with because typically it's because they don't necessarily identify with she, her, or he, his, and they might identify somewhere in the middle, or they don't necessarily identify with either of the binary categories. So they would prefer to be referred to as they. Also, one that you may see is Z and Zer. It is less common. I will say there are other pronouns. This is not the exhaustive list of them. I have heard lots of them. These are the more common ones. I will say, if a young person shares with you their pronouns, use what they tell you they identify with. If it is not on this list, it doesn't matter. Use pronouns that they identify with. So why is this important? All right. First, it's a matter of respect, and everyone desires respect. It is respectful to use the pronouns they identify with. At first, this used to be I prefer certain pronouns. This isn't a preference. This is who that person identifies as. So we want to use terminology that reflects who they are as a person. This concept, I think, can be more difficult for people, especially if you are someone who hasn't had to give much thought to gender as a concept because, maybe your behavior and appearance and dress and physical body parts, all of those things match how you feel about yourself. That is not the case for everyone. So having a variety of words to describe the various ways that people identify is really what helps us communicate who a person is. So that is why we have so many different terms, is because gender is a fluid concept. It is not necessarily in the boxes that we like to put it in. So people's feelings about their gender can be complex, so we need more words to be able to describe that. Also, by using the words that match how a youth identifies, it helps them feel psychologically safe in their home. It helps them feel psychologically safe with you. So making sure that you are using the correct terminology that they identify with is going to go a long way with helping with well-being in general, because first they're going to feel psychologically safe, and then it can help with especially youth who have experienced trauma. It can help with, I can finally start to slowly open up and trust someone, and this may be an early step in that process. The last thing I like to point out is that even if you don't necessarily understand kind of a person's gender or how they identify, it is still valid. The validity of their gender identity is not based on you being able to understand that. So that is important to recognize, that not only is it a matter of respect, it is valid whether you understand it or not. So with that being said, I do like to go a little bit into etiquette around pronouns, because this is where people sometimes have missteps. People know that there are different pronouns, but what do I do if I make a mistake or things like that? So I'm going to go into that. I am going to look just briefly in the chat pod to make sure I don't have any questions that connect to this. Okay, I do see one question about the use of she or they. So we'll go with they because I think that's the one that can sometimes be different people. How should we use that if people ask to go by those pronouns? That's a great question. So anytime that you would use something, if you're more used to using, she or he, so if you say, for example, Jack is going to the movies, he is going with his friend. When you replace the he, you would use they. So Jack is going to the movies. They are going with their friend, and fill in the blank. Where it gets tricky is where you feel like they is plural, but it's really not. So instead of saying she is in her bedroom, you say they are in their bedroom. So you essentially, that's how you would put the pronoun in, is you would use they. It can feel uncomfortable at first because it feels like you're using a plural pronoun when you're referring to a singular person. So that's how you do it. And the same with Z. You would use Z in the place of, other pronouns that you're more familiar with. And if you're unsure of how it fits in, and early on, you can use the person's name. Use that in the place of it while you're still working to figure it out. All right. So I do see a few other comments that I think kind of what we're getting ready to go into around pronoun etiquette will be helpful. So if not, then feel free to put it in the chat pod, and we'll talk about it a little more. All right. So pronoun etiquette. If you make a mistake, mistakes can happen. The important part is correct yourself, because going on as if it didn't happen is actually less respectful than if you actually make that correction. And it also saves the person who was misgendered or misidentified from having to correct an incorrect pronoun. And someone who identifies as gender fluid or transgender, they have to do that a lot. So if you can do that and they don't have to, that is a win. Because being misgendered and correcting pronouns is probably something that they do so many times a day. It gets to be exhausting. It's a lot. Also, if someone else makes a mistake and you were there, correct them. It is okay to provide a correction, whether or not the person whose pronoun was misused is present or not. You don't want to only make the correction when that person is present. So if someone else makes a mistake, correct them. What you do want to do is correct it and then move on. What you don't want to do is correct it and make this whole big, almost like this scene that then turns around to be about you. That you want to correct it and then move on. I made a mistake, use the correct pronoun and then continue. If you aren't sure of a person's pronouns, ask. Don't assume that so a lot of people are like, well, how do I do that? For example, I might say, hi, my name is Crystal and I use she her as my pronouns. What are your pronouns? Because we don't want to assume. When we assume, that's where we can we get into the idea that we feel like just because a person looks a certain way, they should identify as a certain gender, and that is not the case. All right, so yes, it is okay to correct yourself. It is okay to correct others. It is okay to ask about pronouns. It is not okay to ask about gendered body parts or surgeries on private body parts. Just like it is not appropriate for me to ask you about private body parts, it is not okay for you to ask someone just because they identify as transgender to ask them if they've had
the surgery. That's something I hear a lot, is asking questions about that. That is none of your business. If they choose to share it or have that conversation, that is on that person, but that is not okay. I see a few people that have mentioned that it's better to say them or they if you don't know what they go by. Yes, I would agree with that. Is because they is more neutral and it doesn't add that assumption of the she or the he. Then yes, if you don't know, it is more respectful than to make the assumption that you do know. All right. I don't see anything. This one says, you'd be cautious of correcting someone that can come off as rude and could cause a fight. I do agree that you need to be intentional and mindful about your corrections. Because yes, that can go left. Also, thinking about the person that you're making the correction, about. If you just make it a simple correction, they go by the pronoun Z, and then that's okay. But I do agree, you need to be intentional. You can't necessarily make a scene. All right, so we're going to spend I'm going to spend a brief amount of time talking about risk factors because I really want to make sure that what we get to is, okay, what do I do about this? How can I be supportive? So as I go through this section, this is really about all of the different areas that it is important to keep in mind. Okay, so for LGBTQ youth, they are at a higher likelihood that they have experienced traumatic events, especially if they are in foster care. So they have the trauma that and events that come with being in foster care and whatever that may look like, because that journey can look different. And in addition, they may also have additional trauma because of rejection because of their identity. So thinking about, rejection from parents or caregivers, that can cause complex trauma and increase the risk for a lot in a lot of other areas. And that's what we're going to touch on. So yes, rejection can increase the risk of for HIV. It can increase instances of suicide ideation. It also increases homelessness. And if you think about it, a person who has been rejected by their caregivers and the trauma that they have experienced, that series of events that can lead to being more likely to have experienced in some of these areas. Also, higher mental health disparities as compared to their non-LGBTQ peers. Now, this is related to the trauma that they have experienced because of the stigma and possibly because of the rejection that they may have experienced. So specifically on here, I have information from the Trevor Project. So the Trevor Project is a great resource. It's you can look it up, or it's included on that handout. Information that I have here is specific to mental health for LGBTQ youth. 39% of respondents. Now, there were 34,000 youth that answered this national survey. 39% of respondents had seriously considered attempting suicide in the past 12 months, and over 50% of transgender and non-binary youth had seriously considered suicide. And 2/3 of youth in the study reported that someone had tried to convince them to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. The Trevor Project also has a suicide hotline specifically for youth that identify as part of this community who need additional support. And so information for that is included on that handout and is a good resource for you to have. But again, this is easily accessible if you just look up the Trevor Project. Other disparities I want to mention, not just mental health, this can impact health and overall well-being in general. Um, Thinking about the poor outcomes that they face, specifically in thinking about health, because of access to care issues, including like lack of provider knowledge, especially for youth who identify as transgender, and lack of identifying information on intake forms. So if they go to the doctor and there aren't categories that describe their identity, and there's not access to resources, then that can absolutely impact their experiences with healthcare and access to healthcare that is appropriate and matches what their needs may be, because this is not an area that all healthcare providers are knowledgeable in. Also, in thinking about youth who may have experienced trauma or rejection and are seeking partners, to find that, to kind of fill that void, there is evidence that there can be higher number of partners and less contraception use. Specifically, if we think about youth who are rejected and then end up homeless and on the streets, that can add to a lot of health disparities and outcomes related to health. Also including increased risk for sexually transmitted diseases. It can include complications from silicone injections. So for trans women who are unable to access health care that helps their body match how they identify, they can go elsewhere to be injected. So, for example, with to be injected by a pumper is the term that's used, silicone injections, and sometimes they are silicone and sometimes it is other harmful substances for a person's body. And so there has been lots of issues with complications due to injections that were not facilitated at a healthcare provider. Also, it is incredibly important for me to point out and touch on the idea of overlapping identities. So a youth who identifies as LGBTQ plus, and so may also have increased risk factors related to that identity, may also be a part of a population who is also faced with additional risk because of, for specifically, race. So if you think about a young person who is LGBTQ and is a youth of color, so yes, they can be exposed to harassment and bullying for the same reasons as other LGBTQ youth. But in addition to that, they also are faced with racial discrimination and systemic discrimination in school, in juvenile justice systems, in society in general. And so those can have compounding effects. So specifically looking at LGBTQ youth of color, they experience harassment and bullying at higher rates than white LGBTQ youth. Also because of systemic issues, experiencing increased surveillance and policing, and increased reporting, feeling unsafe in school and in their community. And this is compared to other LGBTQ youth. So I just want you to think about this, the lens of the overlapping identities are going to add to the experiences and their narrative can be different because of that identity, in addition to being LGBTQ. And that is important to keep in mind. All right. So next we're going to go into what do I do and how do I be supportive. So when we think about specifically, I'm going to kind of frame this as youth in foster care in your homes. But in general, these, for the most part, can apply to, all youth, not just those in foster care. But I'll start with looking at initial support. So thinking about disclosure. So when a youth feels comfortable and discloses with you, I've often been asked, like, what do I do? What do I say? Like, I want to be supportive, but I don't know how, like, what does that look like? How to do that? Um, so expressing support and acceptance when a child shares their identity, even if you're uncomfortable or surprised, um, thinking about how do I do that? So one way to respond that I share is so starting with thanking them for sharing and telling you. So, thank you for telling me. And then following and asking, how can I support you? Or asking, would you like others to know? So kind of putting those different elements in, starting with, thanking them for telling you, asking how you can support them, and then the last piece is around allowing them to decide who else should know and how and when. Um, this is not something that is necessarily yours to share. So talking with them about would do they want to share it? Do they want you to share it? That is important because they get to decide when to come out to others and what that should look like. Um, and what I'll add about this idea of coming out. Um, a lot of people that don't necessarily have identities associated with this population, think of coming out as this like one time thing. I'm gonna get on a little soapbox here. As a one time thing, like, oh, they came out. So, it's like the battle is done. That is not the case. So coming out is something that it does not just happen one time. And then you're just in the clear. It is something that happens on an almost everyday basis for the rest of your life because it happens with every new interaction. And whether you decide to disclose or not in that moment is, if you decide not to, it's in the back of your mind. So I want you to think about, this is not just oh, they told you and everything's okay now. It's thinking about everyone in their life now, everyone that they come across in the future. That decision to disclose is something that, for some people, it can be a source of anxiety on how are people going to react. Is this something that I share? Is it something that I don't? And so I like to put that out there because it is not something that necessarily everyone recognizes, is that, you know, coming out every day for, years and years, it can be exhausting. So um, just keep that in mind. All right. So we talked about that initial disclosure. So the next area, I'm just going to touch on quite a few different areas of like support at home. And I'm going to touch on, I've seen a few people mention the role of religion. So I am going to get into that absolutely, because that is that can be huge, especially. I mean, yes, we are in the South, and I think it plays a bigger role here. All right, so I'm going to go through a lot of these because I think some of these, at least some of them, may be helpful. All right, so thinking about application of house rules. So you want to apply house rules to children in the home equally, and you don't want to single out someone based on their LGBTQ status. So we want to basically, you want to avoid double standards. LGBTQ youth should be allowed to discuss feelings of attraction just as any other youth. They should be able to have friends who identify or partners who identify as part of this community over to the house just as others can come. So you don't want to have double standards for a youth based on their identity. Also, when you're thinking about how a child dresses when they go to certain places, caregivers shouldn't insist the child, I've heard people use the term dress properly, or like dress how they feel like they should dress as far as their gender, in order to participate in a certain event. So I've seen some parents who will say, I support them and they can dress however they want at home, but when we go over to grandma's house, they have to dress appropriately. That sends the message that other people's comfort is more important than their how they identify. I've heard also people say that you can dress like that at home, but you can't dress a certain way when you go to school. So what we don't want is, again, avoiding double standards for youth who identify as part of this community. So thinking about that, the same grooming rules and restrictions should apply. Makeup and shaving, all of that should apply regardless of gender identity, specifically for this one. Also, use of pronouns and chosen name. So we touched on pronouns. It's important to, yes, continue to use those. Encourage use of those by other members of the family. And then also their chosen name. So if they go by a different name than was on their birth certificate because they don't identify what was on their birth certificate, specifically if it's a more gendered name, using the chosen name is important. That more closely aligns with who that person identifies with. And so refusing to use that is not helpful in helping that child feel psychologically safe. In ensuring messages in religious settings are positive and a cultural fit. It is possible there are faith communities that are more accepting and have religious messages that are supportive to members of the LGBTQ community, especially more so now than I would say even 10 to 15 years ago. But forcing a child to go to a religious setting and hear on a regular basis that what they are doing or who they identify with is a sin and they're going to hell is not acceptable. If you can do everything else right and then that message is something that they hear regularly in a religious setting, that is not okay. And so finding a place where if religion and faith and spirituality is an important part of your family or that child's family, finding a place where the messages are a positive fit is important. That can be easier said than done. A conversation, it is helpful to have a conversation with that young person to talk about, exploring, finding a place that can meet that need for spirituality and also has a positive and cultural fit. Also, encouraging and allowing importance in participating in other LGBTQ social groups if the child is interested. If a child or youth regularly feels like they are surrounded by people they do not identify with, it is important for them to have a space where they are surrounded by people where they have a sense of belonging. For some, especially now, some youth and teens can find that at school, not always. So if they find that elsewhere and it's a social group that they are interested in, that is absolutely okay. It's really about a sense of belonging for them. And also welcoming their friends and partners at home and to family events. So I mentioned that, but what I want to add to it is important to make sure that others in the family also respect this child. Whether they agree or don't agree with, certain aspects or, how you're handling it, what you can require is respect, that this child will be respected. And that goes for, when if they're coming over for holidays or if the person's coming to your home, requiring respect for that child and how they identify, absolutely of utmost importance. So the last area that I'll kind of touch on here is this is support for, kind of school settings and some of those more well-being outcomes. So support in school settings can be difficult because policies in schools are not always the most helpful. So support for children can look a lot of different ways. It depends on what's going on for them. So if the school's policies do not yet address the needs of a transgender youth, it's going to be important to work with and identify how is this child going to be supported at school. For example, thinking about bathrooms or locker rooms, support for navigating those common spaces. That is going to be the case at school and anywhere else they go. And so this is an area where you can absolutely help in, is helping them navigate what is this going to look like. And it's going to look different depending on the school setting and the support that you find there. But absolutely advocating in that setting is incredibly important, because that is where a lot of because of school policies can come into question, and can cause issues for children. In addition, freedom of expression in dress. So this can be now when they go to school. Now, I am not saying that just because a child identifies with as transgender that they don't have to follow school dress codes. Yes, they do, in that you can't, if there's a dress code that a certain length of shorts has to be on, or for no spaghetti strap tank tops, like that you follow. And freedom of expression in dress is however that young person identifies and wants to dress, that is okay. And it is okay for them to dress in that way to go to school. Compartmentalizing gender identity to I can only do it at home and not at school, that does not send accepting and affirming and supportive messages to a child. It is not a problem for a child to go to school dressed as the gender with which they identify. Also advocating for equal access to activities. This can also be challenging. So finding, if there's a specific interest area they can, finding, where can this child participate, where they have a sense of belonging, and whatever that looks like. And again, this is going to be different for every child and for dependent on, kind of what's in your area. So what that advocacy looks like can be difficult, because if you have certain sports that they're only offered with with a certain gender, and a child who doesn't identify with that gender wants to participate, is one example. This can look a lot of different ways. One area that I found a lot of parents have found helpful is for opportunities that are co-ed, that it doesn't matter what gender or biological sex you are, for you to be able to participate. And a lot of times those aren't necessarily always connected to the school setting. And then allowing exploration of resources regarding transition. So this one can spark a lot of conversation. So being able to explore resources for a person to think about what might their future look like is okay. What I am not saying is that, having a surgery at a certain age, that is not up to me. That is not up to you. So I want you to think about, there is a difference in exploring resources for what is possible for, my future, for, is hormones or surgery or none of this. Not everyone who identifies as transgender feels that having their outward expression match who they identify is something that they choose. But if someone chooses to explore resources on something such as hormones or surgery, that is okay, because they're thinking about their future. They're not saying that, it is not up to me or us to say at a certain age it is okay to start taking hormones or surgeries. That is not a conversation that is my role. That is something between, a healthcare provider. But again, allowing exploration. All right, so I'm gonna pause and give a moment for questions. And while I'm looking for those questions, also that handout that I mentioned, there's also a section for learning more. It has resources on there. So there's resources for learning more. There's also resources for like specifically for that Trevor project is included on there. There's also a guide from the Child Welfare Information Gateway that's specifically a report within the last few years where some of this information came from on supporting LGBTQ youth, and it's a guide for foster parents that is also on there. So I'm gonna look in the chat pod for any questions that I feel like we haven't addressed, if there are any. So if you think of any now, then please feel free to jump in there.
I haven't, excuse me, I haven't seen any questions. I've seen a lot of good conversation though, people affirming one another and sharing their own experiences, which is very nice to see too.
I do see a mention of, and I don't know that this is a question, but there was, some comments, and I'll add a little bit more context is, I will say that the bathroom and locker room issue is one that lots of people have ideas and opinions and even sometimes misinformation about. And so what I'm not saying is who should use, what bathroom. I'm saying that advocating for finding a solution for a specific child in your home that works. So whether it is if you go to a public setting and there is a bathroom that is an individual one where they don't necessarily have to go in to one that is gendered, think about, is that a solution? Or, if you have a child who plays a sport and they need to use a locker room, talking with the school, my child doesn't feel comfortable in this locker room. You're saying they can't go in that locker room. What is our plan? So having those conversations is important. All right, so I'm going to mute. If you think of any other questions, please feel free to put them in there. I do want to say thank you for being here and for listening to me somewhat on a soapbox for an hour. This is a topic that is incredibly important to me, and from I can tell from many of we also have some youth and the foster parents here is I feel like things are in a very different place than they were when I was a teenager, and that is a wonderful feeling.
Crystal, I do see, I don't know if you saw that, there's a question from Valerie, who I think mentioned they're interested in maybe attending UNC Chapel Hill, and they would like to know, is UNC Chapel Hill a supportive school for LGBTQ+.
Yes, I just saw that, Valerie. So thank you for asking that. So what I will say is two things. One is a resource in general that can help with that. So I believe it's Campus Pride, who kind of rates different schools across the nation, is one resource that can help you with that. But giving you a little bit of kind of insider information. So I went to school at NC State. I work at UNC Chapel Hill. What I will say is part of it is dependent on sometimes the department that you are within. And it also depends on, I will say that residence life, campus life, resources related to that, absolutely a supportive school. I always feel like there's room for improvement, but I would say that about any campus. But yes, I would say that in general, they are and are heading in the right direction for supporting LGBTQ plus youth, as well as, some of my experiences with other colleges. I would say campus in general is an improving space. I also something that I recommend some people to look at is they also have living and learning communities that are specific just to this population. So that can also help us in some belonging. So I'll stop there. Valerie, please feel free to reach out if you have any other questions specifically. And I see Shisha. Go Pack. Yes.
All right, I think it is 12:01. So I just want to say thank you to Crystal very much for sharing that information. Very helpful. I always love hearing Crystal present. I always learn a lot. And also thank you to everyone in the chat too. I was keeping an eye on that. And again, you all very supportive and very affirming of one another, which is great to see. So thank you all for being a part of this today. And thanks for joining us. We hope you have a great rest of your day. And please reach out to us if you have any questions.